Okay. Okay, good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavirdyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shantihi Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhutaguhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Shri Vavide Namaha. Welcome back. We're resuming our class after a bit of a break for the holidays. Also, we are now meeting in a new hall for our online students. Let me just show you. So we are now meeting in our small hall. I shouldn't call it old hall, because many people don't know that in 2000, when we came here, all of our classes met here in this small hall. When we became overcrowded, then we built the main lecture hall. And it's very nice to have our local students attending these classes for years and years. We've had these Vedanta classes. So welcome to you. Welcome also to the many students who attend these classes online. We are continuing in the end of chapter 14. And yes? Video recording is on, yes. Thank you for checking. Here at the excuse me, at the end of chapter 14, Shankara, in this Upadesha Sahasri, this brilliant text of Sri Shankara, he is engaged in a really profound presentation of the nature of Atma being a Sangha. Let me explain that before we plunge in here. Atma, of course, as you've heard me say again and again, is not a concept, an idea. People say the Atma. There is no the Atma. There's only your essential nature as a conscious being. The consciousness present in your experience right now is Atma. If you say, how can that consciousness seem so ordinary? How can that consciousness be Atma? Good, that's the right question to ask, and that's what we explore in these teachings. Shankara here in the past verses and coming verses has been saying that the consciousness by which you know what's happening right now is a Sangha, utterly unaffected, unscathed, untouched by all the problems of worldly life. And the reason for that, when we think about being detached, being away from all these problems, we think of some kind of distance. So if there's someone you have a problem with, you avoid them. And that way you remain unaffected by their behavior. But here, it's not a matter of distance. For example, we're talking about the distance between Atma, consciousness, and your mind. What is the distance between consciousness and mind? No distance whatsoever. So then how can Atma be a Sangha if there's no distance whatsoever? And the reason is Atma is of a different order of reality. In fact, let me introduce that. There's a question from the last class that will allow me to explore this further with you. This is Vishaka. She asks a question with regard to this very topic. In a previous class, I explained that we can't mix dream water and real water. And that's a very effective example. You can't mix them together. There's no contact between them whatsoever, no interaction, because they're different orders of reality. Dream water is less real than waking water. In order for there to be any contact whatsoever, they have to belong to the same order of reality. This is the basic metaphor we use to understand how Atma can be asanga, utterly unaffected, unscathed, untouched by worldly troubles, because the world around you is less real than consciousness. Just as dream water is less real than real water, in the same way, the world is less real than consciousness, than your true nature. Remember our understanding of reality? Generally, we understand reality in terms of that which is absolutely stable, that which is unchanging. Something that comes and goes is transient, not very real. Something that remains is what is real. Obviously, dream water doesn't last very long, only until you wake up. Even even the water that comes out of your tap, real water, is not that real, because at the end of the cycle of creation, that water also ceases to exist, as opposed to consciousness, your essential nature, which is unborn, uncreated, unchanging, and therefore more real than the world. So just as the water out of your tap being more real than dream water, you can't mix them together because they're of different orders of reality. The same is true here with regard to consciousness and world consciousness being more real. So Vishaka's question then, the body and mind, we will include, is at a transactional level of reality. These are the levels of reality we described maybe long ago, and I don't want to get into this technical subject matter, paramartika satta, vyavaharika satta, pratibhasika satta. If you remember that discussion, very good. If you don't worry about it. That complicated terminology is not so necessary right now. What is necessary is to know, and her question, she says, how is it that absolute reality, consciousness, can interact with the body and mind, which is not as real? She says, how? How indeed? That's the question. And she herself gets it. Or does it illuminate consciousness? Does consciousness illumine our experiences without interaction? She answers her own question. There is no interaction. This may be counterintuitive. There's no interaction whatsoever between consciousness and your body and mind. That seems counterintuitive at first, but when we understand, especially with Shankara's brilliant text, when we understand consciousness as your essential nature, as the awareful witness of whatever is happening in your mind, that's a correct definition. Consciousness is you as the awareful observer or witness of everything that happens in your mind. The moment we use that word witness, in Sanskrit sakshi, witness by definition is uninvolved, right? And sometimes we use the word bystander, someone who is nearby but not directly involved. Consciousness is that bystander is a silly way of putting it, but awareful witness, sakshi, indeed. Another way of understanding it is that which illumines is not really involved. This light illumines my body. Is it involved in teaching? It reveals the teaching that's going on, but it's not involved in the process of teaching. In the same way, consciousness reveals the activities of your body and mind, but is not directly involved. The light is a poor metaphor because the light is as real as his body and mind, but consciousness is more real than your body and mind, and therefore, asanga. All right, really important to get this orientation before we plunge in to these very profound verses. Otherwise, many people will try to read a text like this on their own, and very quickly they become disappointed because it's because it is what it is. These are some of the most profound teachings of Shankaracharya. We have to be ready for this. So, with this introduction, let us proceed. There we go. So, and here we have the, if you remember, at the end of this chapter, let me turn this up a little bit. At the end of this chapter, we have verses in a longer meter with a different mode of chanting. Repeat after me. Sharir, yeah, right, correct. Sharira buddhyor yadi chanya drishyata. Sharira buddhyor yadi chanya drishtata. Niratmavada sunirakrita maya. Niratmavada sunirakrita maya. Parascha siddho yavashuddhi karmataha. Parascha siddho yavishuddhi karmataha. Sunirmala sarvagato sito dvayaha. Sunirmala sarvagato sito dvayaha. I should mention that the next two verses, very interesting. Shankara is going to, he is still establishing the asangata of Atma. That ta ending is like the nes ending in English. Ta and tvam in Sanskrit have the same function as nes in English. So asangata. I don't think we have an English word exactly for that. Detachedness, unrelatedness. Anyway, that's the sense of it. Okay. So to explain this this asangata, Shankara is going to refer to two refutations. Refutation of the Buddhist point of view and refutation of a materialist point of view. That's what we're going to see in these two verses. First, refutation. This is Shankara's refutation of Buddhism. Of course, in his commentaries, especially commentaries on Brahma Sutra, very elaborately he refutes the teachings of Buddhism. Here, in one verse, very briefly, he hints at all these refutations. He says, Sharira buddhoho yadi cha anya drishyata. Sharira buddhyor, for the body and mind, they possess anya drishyata. There's that ta ending again. The state of being observed by something else. Body, and this is Vedanta 101, but watch where Shankara goes with this. Your body and mind are known to you. Known? Who is the knower? You, the conscious being. So you, the conscious being, you are the subject. The body is an object. Your thoughts, emotions, sensations are all objects, and you are the awareful observer of all these objects, which means anything you observe is different from you. Right? This is basic. I observe this paper. That's enough to establish that this paper is separate from me. Anything observed is not me. And this is the logic here, that your body and mind are known to another. What is that other? Consciousness. With this very simple logic, Sri Shankara says, Niratma-vadaha su nirakritaha maya. He says that Niratma-vadaha, correctly translated, those who hold to the doctrine of Niratma-vada, the absence of Atma, the non-existence of Atma. So simply anatma is there what they believe to be the truth. Instead of anatma, he uses the term niratma, means exactly the same. So Niratma-vada is a reference to Buddhism. In particular, a school of Buddhism known, it actually applies generally to Buddhism, but when Shankara gets into it in negating the Buddhists, he often focuses on in his time, a popular school of Buddhism known as Shunyavada. Shunyavada is a doctrine that says everything is shunyam. There is no, shunyam means nothing. In fact, shunyam is the Sanskrit word for zero, which is interesting. So, and nothing means nothing substantial, nothing real. And it's not surprising that the Buddhists come to that perspective, because with our definition of real is that which is unchanging. Look around you. Can you find anything that's unchanging? Without exception, everything we experience in life, including our own bodies and minds, are constantly changing, therefore unreal. Based on that, Buddha concluded that often the word emptiness is used. Buddhists seem to like that word. What is empty, empty meaning empty of reality. Not empty of names and forms, there's plenty of that. But no underlying reality. That which is empty of reality, bereft of reality, that is shunya. And obviously that's refuted here, because the body and mind, which are definitely not real, are observed by a consciousness that is real, unborn, uncreated, and unchanging. From a Buddhist standpoint, there is, in fact, this part may seem counterintuitive. We actually have to find out what they mean. If you think, when the Buddhist says there is no Atma, if you hear that as there's no conscious observer, that doesn't make sense, right? These Buddhists were tremendous scholars. They're not going to say there's no observer. What they meant was the observer is empty of reality. That's what Shunyavada means. Not that there is no conscious witness. There is a conscious witness. It's part of your experience. How can you deny that there is a conscious observer aware of your body and mind? No one can refute that, but the Buddhists claim that that conscious observer is not real. It is also subject to change. It is also born, created, subject to destruction. This is a Buddhist standpoint. How different from the Advaita Vedanta perspective of Atma being unborn, uncreated, eternal, your inner divinity. We use all of this language. And if you ask, why do we have this insight in Advaita Vedanta, and why does Buddhism not have this particular insight. And there are lots of similarities. Most of you know there are many, many similarities between Buddhism and Hinduism. But what's significant is that Buddha himself rejected the authority of the Vedas. And by the way, this is the technical reason that Buddhism is considered a separate religion. Because everything Buddha taught is acceptable to Hindus in one way or another. Everything Buddha taught is ultimately acceptable. Then why is Buddhism called a different religion? Because he rejected the authority of the Vedas. Hinduism is a religion based on the Vedas, so the moment he rejects their authority, then that puts him outside of the Hindu fold, so to speak. But the more significant consequence of his rejection of the authority of the Vedas is the Vedas contain the Upanishads. The Upanishads are the ecstatic revelations of the ancient rishis. He's deprived of those revelations. We've spoken, and this is a huge topic, just to say very briefly, when we say again and again, Vedanta is based on Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. Shruti is scripture, Yukti reasoning, and Anubhava experience. And it's like a three-legged table. Is that showing? Yeah. There you go. A three-legged table on which Vedanta stands. Well, Buddha rejected Shruti, scriptural authority. Now you have a two-legged table. What happens to a two-legged table? There's no such thing as a two-legged table. You require at least three. So this is how we understand how Buddhists, in spite of, there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in that tradition, but they missed out on Shruti, on the inspired revelations of the ancient rishis. Since we're talking a little bit about Buddhism, many of you have heard the statement, Shankaracharya defeated the Buddhists and returned India to the Vedas. And it all sounds pretty impressive, but it's not exactly how it worked. So why don't we just a few minutes about what actually took place. So if you ask some, let me not say that. What really happened, get the dates right, Buddha lived about 2,500 years ago. He formed his own doctrine, and from that time onwards, that doctrine spread. Spread where? First, through India. He was born in Nepal, what is now Nepal, and then lived in what is now, I think, Bihar. So, Buddha was an Indian, undoubtedly, and probably had a Hindu background. His family in Nepal, very likely, practiced Hindu culture as it was practiced at that time. Very different from modern Hindu culture, but associated with that Vedic tradition. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you the story of Buddha, but what happened to Buddhism is what we'd like to understand. So that Buddhism spread out starting in 2,500 years ago. It spread out in India. It also spread now beyond the shores of India. It spread to Sri Lanka. It spread to Cambodia. It spread to Thailand, near India. That's the first place. It later spread to China and Japan, and later yet it came up and around into Tibet. But its first expansion was into these nearby South Asian countries, especially Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand. These would be. Now, when Buddhism, I'll make this short, but I think you'll find it helpful just to get the picture of what happened with Buddhism. When Buddhism expanded into Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and other nearby South Asian countries, it remained pretty close to what Buddha taught. But what's interesting is that the Buddhism within India itself underwent more development. I don't know if you care about sociology. When a religion gets exported to another country, that religion is frozen in time so that it advances in the mother country but remains old-fashioned. And a great example of this is if you know any Guyanese Hindus, right? They're more Hindu than you are. How can that be? Because Hindus went to Guyana 250 years ago or so, and they brought with them the Hinduism of 250 years, and they kind of maintained that tradition in Guyana, whereas India continued to evolve. It's a very interesting sociological phenomenon, at least interesting to me, but I don't know, it may not be interesting at all to you. But that's important to understand what happened to Buddhism, because the Buddhism exported to Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and perhaps Thailand was like the Hinduism exported to Guyana, old-fashioned. As opposed to what happened in India, especially after the millennia, so from zero to actually to Shankara's time, Shankara being about 1200 years ago. So Buddhism continued to evolve, and in a very scholarly way. All of the texts of that period are in Sanskrit, highly scholarly Sanskrit. So there's something about India where there's a focus on the spiritual scholarship. And when I say spiritual scholarship, it's not philosophy, it's not scholarship for the sake of scholarship, like in a university program. This is scholarship for the sake of spiritual growth. So Buddhism developed a lot along this scholarly path in India. When Shankara came, about 1200 years ago, by the way, some people will claim that Shankara lived 500 BCE and all of this stuff. There's no historical substantiation for that. All well-informed scholars will say Shankara lived approximately 1200 years ago. So when Shankara came, undeniably, Shankara studied Buddhist teachings. Undeniably, because how could he refute them if he didn't study them? Of course he studied them. And perhaps he may even have gotten some insights from them. Of course, now based on those insights, some anti-Shankara scholars call Shankaracharya a crypto-Buddhist. How's that for a term? Shankara was called a crypto-Buddhist because he used some insights from the Buddhist tradition. Doesn't make him a Buddhist. Remember, Buddhism rejects the authority of the Vedas. Shankara held on to those Upanishads. Shankara is certainly not a crypto-Buddhist, but we forget that in ancient times, even today, there is an interaction. In fact, especially today, we live in this global culture. Look what interaction amongst cultures have done. In this country, in India, around the world, there's so much interaction. So even in ancient India, there was interaction between Buddhist scholars and Hindu scholars, Vedantins. They interacted, and it's a good thing, right? We learned from each other. So Shankara learned something from the Buddhists, not that he gave up his Advaita Vedanta, but he found certain insights in the teachings of the Buddhists, which he incorporated. But the opposite was less true. That is, the Buddha, actually I can't say less true, arguably more true. So the Buddhists looked, in fact, more true. I have to retract that, I misspoke. When the Buddhists looked at Shankara's teachings, they found them so profound that they gradually, over a period of hundreds of years, left their Buddhist teachings behind and came to follow Shankaracharya's teachings. This is what happened in India. There was no defeat of Buddhism, but rather Shankara's teachings were so profound, so powerful, that these great Buddhist scholars were won over by Shankara's powerful expressions. So over a period of century, these Buddhist scholars came into the groove, so to speak, established by Shankara. In that way, now today you find very, very few Buddhists in India for this very reason. On the other hand, in Sri Lanka, in Cambodia, Thailand, mostly Buddhists. So this is a uniquely Indian phenomenon due to Shankaracharya. Okay, I've gone on way too long about that, but it's, I think, something many people are interested in understanding. It's also very much misunderstood. Shankara defeats the Buddhists. We have to be a little less naive in our approach here. Okay, so Shankara says, Niratmavadaha su nirakrataha. Nirakrata, dismissed. Su nirakrata, completely dismissed, completely refuted. Maya, by me. The doctrines of the Buddhist, the doctrine of the absence of Atma, completely rejected from me, by me, rejected through my teachings, through my logic. And this is, all of Vedanta is not only negation, like refuting the Buddhist doctrines, like neti neti, but there's also assertions. So negation, he says nirakrita, but then what about assertions? In the third line, he says siddha. So something has been established, proven. And what has been siddha in the third line, what has been established or proven is that which is paraha, beyond. There's our different levels of reality. Like the water out of your tap is beyond dream water in the sense that it's more real than dream water. In the same way, the consciousness that is your essential nature, is paraha, beyond, in the sense of more real than the world. And it is then paraha, beyond what? You have to break the words apart. Hi avishuddha karmataha. It is beyond the ashuddhi, the impurities, which are karmataha, born of karmas. And the Shankara is just being very terse here. So a huge teaching in just a couple of words. When you associate yourself with the activities of your body and mind, when you identify with the activities of your body and mind, you then own the problems of your body and mind. So if you're identified with the body and the body is sick, you say, I am sick. If the mind is agitated and you're identified with the mind, you say, I am Notice you don't say, my body is sick. Who talks like that? My mind is agitated. Somebody might use that expression, but generally, I am sick. I am agitated, and this is the problem of identification, which is negated by Shankaracharya. That's the earlier parts of this chapter. Remember, we're right at the end of this chapter now. So what he establishes then is that your true nature is paraha, beyond the body and mind. Back to Asanga. That's beyond in the sense not sharing the same order of reality. I'm looking for another metaphor because that can be a little bit abstract. I don't want it to be abstract for any of you. So here, let's go back to our most familiar metaphor. Clay is more real than the pot. Why? Pot can come and go, clay remains. If I break this pot, if I crush it into dust, pot goes away, clay remains. So clearly, clay is more real than the pot. So now we have this question, how do the pot and clay interact? How interact is, again, abstract. Let me really want to make this concrete. How does the pot affect the clay? If the pot is cracked, crackpot? Sorry, it's kind of an obvious joke. Hard to miss that one. Anyway, if the pot is cracked, how does that affect the clay? If the pot is painted blue, how does that affect the clay? If the pot is big or small, how does that affect the clay? You get the point? And that means that clay in this metaphor is a sangha. It is unaffected by the nature of the pot. Why? Because clay is more real than pot. So this is the important take-home message for today, is that Atma is asanga because Atma is more real than the world around us. Okay. And then Shankara just concludes. He says, therefore, Atma is sunirmalaha, absolutely pure, being utterly unaffected by anything in the world. Atma is sarvagataha, consciousness is all-pervasive. We've had long discussions about that. We need not go back. He's just giving this list of terms that describes Atma, knowing that it's all been taught thoroughly prior in a chapter, but we're not going to go through all those details here. So Atma is sunirmala, absolutely pure, being unaffected by body, mind, etc. Atma is sarvagataha, all-pervasive, boundaryless, infinite, for reasons we've discussed. Atma is asitaha, we have to break the words apart. Atma is not bound. Atma doesn't gain moksha. Atma doesn't need Vedanta. Atma doesn't care about Swami Tadatmananda's teachings. Useless for Atma. Helpful for the one who says, I suffer. Atma doesn't say, I suffer. You might. Atma doesn't say that. So, the teachings of Vedanta are for the one who is in bondage, jiva, but here, Atma itself is asitaha, never got bound in the first place. And finally, Shankara says, Atma is advayaha, non-dual. We've had long discussions about that. We won't go further there. So with this verse, 45, Buddhism is rejected. Why? Not for... I don't know if this is a fair comparison or not. Is Shankara wants to be right? You know how people love to argue, and they love to argue about religion and spiritual matters and all of this stuff, and wants to be right? That reminds me, when I was in my 20s, I was one of those arrogant ones who I always wanted to be right, and it was a huge problem. Anyway, is Shankara like that? He wants to be right and show that the Buddhists are wrong, or does he refute Buddhism for the sake of establishing that Atma is a Sangha? What is his motivation? His motivation is not to blast the Buddhists. No vested interest in doing so. His interest is to teach us that Atma is a Sangha, and he finds it helpful here to refer to Buddhism and show how Buddhists go off the track. Now, in the next verse, he is now, we can say, attacking the materialists, but with the same motivation. It's not like he wants to show the materialists are wrong and we are right. That's not his motivation. His motivation, again, is to teach us, and still we're talking about teach us that Atma is a Sangha, utterly unaffected. So let's see that verse. Gatari rupam yadi te na grihyate. Gatari rupam yadi te na grihyate. Manah pravrittam bahudha swavrittibihi. Manah pravrittam bahudha swavrittibihi. Ashuddhya chidrupa vikara doshata. Ashuddhya chidrupa vikara doshata. Materyatha varayatum na paryate. Materyatha varayatum na paryate. Good. Yes, checking all of this stuff. All right. So here he says, yadi te, if it is your belief, your contention, that ghatadi rupam, that which is in the form of a ghata, this is a ghata. So that which is in the form of a ghata, but what is in the form of a ghata? We're not talking about clay now, we're talking about your experience of the ghata. Your experience of the ghata is the pot in your mind. That's the pot we're talking about. Not this one made of clay, but the pot in your mind is what we're talking about here. So that ghatadi rupam, that pot, which is manaha, which is a form in your mind, that pot, yadite, suppose you think that that pot in your mind is na grihyate, is not perceived, is not observed, drop down, swavrittibihi, through the act. Vritti means mental activity. Through the vrittis of your mind, the activities of your mind, the thoughts and perceptions of your mind, which are bahudha pravrittam, which go on pravrittam, they are engaged, bahudha, in many ways. If you see a chair, there is a chair vritti. You see a pot, there's a pot vritti. You see a swami, there's a swami vritti. Bahudha pravrittam. The mind is variously engaged. But yadi te na grihyate. If you assert that there na grihyate, there is no observer of the pot in your mind. Now, that may sound technical. It's not. It's simple. There's a pot here. There's a pot in your mind. There's a pot in my hand, okay, but we're not talking about this one. We're talking about the pot in your mind. Is that pot in your mind known or unknown? Known. Grihyate. It is grasped. But yadi te na grihyate. If you say that there is no one home, so to speak, who grasps, who perceives, who observes the pot in your mind, this is a doctrine of materialism. What exists is brain and mind and nothing. Only brain and mind. This is materialism. This is modern science. There's a lot of neuroscience going on today, which is attempting to show that all mental activities are directly caused by the brain. And eventually, they will succeed in showing how every single activity of your mind is the direct result of the processes going on in the neurons of your brain. That's not yet been fully proven. It will eventually be proven. It may take 100 years, but they will, not that long. They'll get there. But, and that is a doctrine of materialism, that you are this body-mind complex. Now, if you ask those scientists, what about consciousness? Very interesting. The response of scientists and philosophers who are rooted in Western traditions, they do their best to reject consciousness by using all kinds of strange arguments. There's a nice expression in India. When you get unnecessarily overly complex in trying to make a point. This is what scientists do, and the expression some of you have seen before, if you want to touch your nose like this, that's overly complex. So these scientists are involved, and the Western philosophers are involved in this, to me, and I've studied it to some extent. I'm interested in it, so I've studied it to some extent. These Western philosophers and scientists are doing their best to disprove consciousness. And if you think that's counterintuitive, it is. Because every scientist and philosopher is a conscious being. Trying to prove the non-existence of consciousness is trying to disprove your own existence as a conscious being. But they come up with all these complex reasons. There are many who say that our experience of consciousness is illusory. They say that due to the complex interaction and structure of the neurons in your brain, it gives rise to these mental events which seem to be known by a conscious being. This is mainstream science. And other scientists, that's one school of scientists who are trying to establish this, that there is no such thing as consciousness. Famous philosophers, if you've ever heard the name Daniel Dennett, he is perhaps one best known for this ideology of absolutely dismissing the reality of consciousness as an illusory experience, according to Professor Dennett. There are other scientists who want to show that consciousness, they use the term epiphenomenon, a side effect of mental activity, a side effect of the brain's functioning. It just comes into your experience when your brain and mind are churning. You get this feeling of observing what's happening in your mind. There are other doctrines as well. It's a huge, and we won't go further into this. It is just a huge, and one important point I should make here, and that is, in spite of the efforts, there's one modern philosopher that I find fascinating. His name is David Chalmers, and he promotes a doctrine called panpsychism, which has some similarity to Vedanta, but not much. At least, but he refutes Western materialism. He says science cannot account for consciousness. So he comes close to, on this point, he's very Vedantic. He says science deals with the observed, consciousness is the observer. He gets it. David Chalmers, a Western philosopher, he's actually from Australia, a very popular guy, very well known. In fact, he's well known for this expression. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, which refers to the impossibility of science proving or disproving the existence of consciousness, because science deals with the observed. Consciousness belongs to the observer. So that part Chalmers got right. What is consciousness is another thing. So he's obviously not a Vedantan, and I don't know if he has been exposed much to these teachings, but he ascribes to a doctrine called panpsychism. I won't explain it here. You can look it up if you're interested. It's not Vedanta. It is a modern philosophical way of trying to understand consciousness. Really? Reinventing the wheel? Why is Chalmers and all these modern philosophers, why are they struggling so much with this? The ancient rishis figured it out thousands of years ago, and their discoveries, I think, if Chalmers studied those teachings of the ancient rishis thoroughly, I think he would get convinced. They're that powerful. So, and the point I'm making is these philosophers, instead of going back and looking at these ancient traditions, they're making up their own stuff. Panpsychism is a modern idea. Why invent new concepts and ideas when you could go back to the discovery of these ancient rishis and gain such a clear and profound understanding? Anyway, this is the problem of modern materialism. Science, of course, is materialism. By the way, materialism is a technical term in philosophy, and what it means in philosophy is what exists is material. That's what and nothing else, meaning no consciousness, just material stuff. Okay, enough said. So we understand that there must be an observer. Some scientists will acknowledge that, some philosophers like David Chalmers will acknowledge it, but by and large, science and Western philosophy reject consciousness as we understand it. What is the consequence of that materialism? Huge consequence. Look at this, if there's, according to science and Western philosophy, you are body and mind. What else is there? There's nothing more. You are the sum total of all of these parts, and definitely you can argue that the whole is greater than the parts. Absolutely, human beings are glorious creations. Our capabilities are absolutely amazing. Of course, the parts of which we're made are pretty amazing, especially the brain. So anyway, amazing creatures made of flesh and bone and neurons. There is such a thing as mind. Science and these philosophers, they accept the existence of mind, but not consciousness. Again, complex topic. We won't go further into it. How they can accept mind without consciousness is something Vedanta would simply refute. Shankara would say. Anyway, we won't get into that right now. But if there is no consciousness, as the materialism says, if all there is body and the processes of the body, which is mind. There's another fancy philosophical doctrine called functionalism. And the function of your brain gives rise to the mind. It's all function. It's all neural activity. But the consequence of this is if I equals body and mind, that means the defects, limitations, and problems of the body and mind are my defects and problems. The body is subject to illness, disease, death. I am dying. That's grim. Body is dying is a fact. Each one of these bodies here will die. That's just a reality, and we can understand that reality, but if you say, I am dying, that's grim. And that kind of conclusion is a source of suffering. And for these scientists, there's no other way of putting it. The scientists would have to say, I am dying. I'm dying in the sense that, eventually life will come to an end. There's no way out. The way out in Advaita Vedanta is to disidentify with your body and mind, and instead understand yourself to be that consciousness, the consciousness by which the body and mind and everything else are known. In this way, through this kind of detachment, there's a sangha again, being a sangha, being detached, being unconnected to the body and mind, then the problems of the body and mind belong to the body and mind, and significantly, the problems don't belong to you. And this is how Shankara concludes here. He says that if you adopt, first half of the verse, if you adopt this principle of materialism by denying the existence of consciousness, what is the consequence of that? He says the consequence is you get stuck with ashuddhi, impurity, achidrupa, the absence of being a conscious being, and vichara, constantly undergoing change, doshata, there's a ta again. These are the defects, which these defects of impurity, not being a conscious being, and constant change, these defects, matehe, in the last line, of the mind, these defects of the mind now belong to you. They don't belong to the mind, they belong to you. The problems of the body belong to you. Problems of the mind belong to you. And he says, na paryate varayatum, and you can't escape it. You cannot avoid the problems of you cannot varayatum, avoid. You cannot push away the problems of your body and mind if you are your body and mind. There's no way out. You will suffer. According to some Western philosophers, you will suffer and suffer and suffer, and then you'll die. That's what it comes down to. And there's navarayatum. There's no way to avoid this if Shankara says yadite, if you ascribe to this doctrine of materialism. I've talked about the scientists and Western philosophers. We should know that scientists and Western philosophers, that's their profession. In their personal life, there are scientists who are devout Christians and believe in Jesus, believe that they're going to heaven. There are scientists who are devout Muslims, devout anything, Jews, and they ascribe to their religious practices, and Of course, as scientists, it's a completely different thing. And if you ask them, how do you reconcile your scientific profession and your religious beliefs, most scientists will simply say, I don't try to reconcile them. This is what I do for a living. I am a scientist professionally. Anyway, just to make this point, and how different it is in Vedanta. Is this teaching a profession? Is it something we do? Is it something we even practice? Really speaking, these Vedantic teachings, you know this so well, but just to summarize it at the end of our class, these Vedantic teachings are not science. Some people like this word, spiritual science. It may sound good, but science is about the world, right? What you observe. Scientific inquiry is based on observation. So therefore it's worldly in orientation. So you can't call Vedanta a science, nor can we call it a philosophy. Remember, we've observed that philosophy is a pursuit of knowledge because knowledge is valuable. But here in Vedanta, knowledge is not what we... Yes, in a manner of speaking, we say we seek knowledge, but not for the sake of knowledge. A philosopher seeks knowledge for the sake of... seeks knowledge for the sake of getting a PhD degree so they can teach someplace. Anyway, there's some career motivation. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're seeking knowledge for that reason. We seek knowledge, that is in the teachings of Vedanta. Knowledge is valuable insofar as it puts an end to human suffering. That's scientists and philosophers do not have that particular orientation. So let's be very clear. Vedanta is neither a science nor a philosophy. So here we've concluded Shankara. I spent a long time on these two verses, but I think when we deal with other schools of thought, like Buddhism, like science and materialism, then we have to kind of go into those schools of thought to understand clearly what is Shankara's point in those refutations. But you can see Shankara's motivation is not to be right and prove that Buddhism and materialism is wrong. His point here is to show that your true nature as pure consciousness is asanga, utterly unaffected, untainted, unscathed by any worldly trouble, because it is more real. Consciousness being more real than the world. And this is a very good place to stop for this evening. We'll conclude with our prayer. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschad dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om. That's it.